Hour 22 is where we start talking about Plato and Plato's Socrates, which is something different than saying Socrates, the historical Socrates, because everything that Socrates is quoted as saying by Plato is part of Plato's own philosophical agenda. That said, I should emphasize that Plato really does try to be as historically accurate as possible in portraying Socrates. In text A, we see Socrates talking about this superhuman thing that has a mysterious way of telling him what not to do. It seems as if this thing, called either daimonion or sēma, is a negative force, not a positive force. Or to put it better, a negative force for good, since according to Plato's Socrates, the daimonion, or the sēma, this superhuman force, is only telling Socrates what is morally wrong and what he shouldn't do. It doesn't tell him what to do, and so Socrates says, that's funny, the daimonion hasn't been warning me away from what is now happening, so what's happening must be the right thing. For us, the fact that daimonion is derived from daimōn, which we've been studying for such a long time in this project, and the fact that sēma is derived from sēma, sign, signal, symbol, or tomb of a hero, just shows how both these words are quite relevant to ideas about the hero. And it's very clear that Plato's Socrates is using words, and using them very precisely, that have an important role in our understanding of what a hero is. And of course, Socrates being Socrates, he has to entertain two extreme scenarios of what happens after death. One of them, which would be total annihilation, is philosophically plausible, but is certainly contradictory to the idea of the hero as we have been studying it, where, as we know, the hero is immortalized after death. In any case, here in text A2, Socrates, or should I say Plato's Socrates, sets up the opposition. Afterlife or no afterlife. Afterlife modeled on the afterlife of a hero, non-afterlife being a very frightening concept that all of us have to reckon with, no matter what our worldviews or belief systems. In text A3, Socrates gives a very engaging portrait of what it would be like to black out completely after death. And he uses the metaphors that we often use for a good night's sleep to help understand how that might be and how that might not be the worst thing in the world. But then in text A4, as you see, I've broken up text A into several subsections. You have a very accurate description of what poetry in particular, and myth in general, would say about the afterlife for ancient Greek heroes. And it's not one particular model, it's a composite of several models, but each word that is being used here in describing the afterlife is relevant to us and is even familiar to us on the basis of what we have been reading. Whenever an afterlife is envisioned for heroes, this paradise-like existence, which is somehow beyond today's time and today's places that we know. And I pay attention not only to words for the afterlife, but even adverbs like there or here, because even those seemingly trivial words are used so precisely by Plato's Socrates. Again, you get a very good idea of what's everyday and what's beyond the everyday. And the realm that is beyond the everyday is measured by way of the world of heroes. In A4 and in A5, to which I very briefly turn, the moral core of the message of Socrates is absolute justice. Not just judgments, whether they're right or wrong, but absolute justice and the quality of being just. You see, this is what the daimonion, or the sēma, was not warning Socrates about. So he figures, as he says, that he must be doing the just thing. He must be standing up for the just thing. And that is because he has not been warned off by these superhuman forces. But I'm so fascinated by the fact that these superhuman forces are formulated in terms of the idea of a cult hero. Well, finally, towards the very end of the apology, Socrates says, well, it's time to stop talking. I'm going in one direction. All of you who are going to stay alive are going in another direction, and who knows which is the better alternative. He leaves it open. In text B of our 22, one of my favorite passages in the writings of Plato, Plato's Socrates actually compares himself to Achilles, not so much as a personality, but as somebody who has to make a choice between what is the just, the right thing to do, and what is the unjust and wrong thing to do. And we've already looked at this previously. Plato's Socrates, in a sense, is merging two passages from the Iliad, where Achilles is making his choices, one of them in Rhapsody 9 and the other in Rhapsody 18. But Plato is doing really good fast reading here, since if you do put the relevant passage in Rhapsody 9 and the relevant passage in Rhapsody 18 together, there really is a moral consistency to how the choices of Achilles, and there are really only two, how those choices are evolving and how he will choose an early death, but that in return for that he will have a kleos, a poetic glory that is unwilting. So much for the Achilles analogy. I also want to bring up the Odysseus analogy, which you see in text C, where Socrates is talking about his life in terms of a journey of a soul, and we already know that such a metaphorical journey is an Odyssean journey. The beautiful thing is that it's not just Odysseus who's a model here, it's even an earlier picture of a hero, and that's Herakles himself. Herakles, likewise, is portrayed as wandering, as veering, in words that are very close to the way the wandering and veering of Odysseus are described. And this analogy with Herakles will be very important when we get to our 23. And I don't even need to say that text E and the precise wording of the Odyssey in text E bears out what I'm saying about the close analogy between the Odyssean model of Socrates and the Odyssean model of Odysseus himself. Then in text F of our 22, we have what I've been promising from the very start, a most articulate description of the myth of the swan song and how the swan sings the most beautiful song of its life at the moment of death. And in this case, we see that the swan, in singing this song, is considered to be a minister of Apollo, but a better word for it is a therapon, a ritual substitute, a word that is so familiar to us from our previous readings. So once again, even the concept of a swan song as the final dialogue of Socrates is cast in a heroic mode. And that is a very brief sketch of the texts that we are reading for hour 22, which have to be very closely compared with the texts that we will now read for hour 23.